Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you, Regina and Michael, for inviting me. Thank you, most importantly, as well, for supporting our books over the years. Because as I'm sure you know, and all of you can imagine, it's quite a difficult process making these books. I am a bookmaker, and I use that term quite specifically, not simply to avoid the phrase publisher, which I think is a little bit overblown, but it also suggests a certain remove, a certain distance from the process. The process being one of an editorial process, a design process, production, marketing, sales, accountant, somebody who carries the tissue box for the artist very often. The point is, the reason I do what I do is because I'm engaged and interested in the process of making, in the collaborative process. Publisher suggests somebody who sits above all this process and beyond it. I also don't want to suggest that I do all this myself alone. I have an extraordinary team of people who I work very closely with. But I just wanted to nail my colors to the mast in terms of what it is that I'm interested in, and hopefully that will become apparent. So this afternoon I'm going to show you a selection of books from my past, present, and future. I suppose to kind of show you a life in books, but also to use these as a backdrop for this conversation with you, a backdrop to the story of what has happened in this contemporary space of book publishing in general, illustrated and art book publishing, and specifically the photo book. Even though that's not the only area I operate in, I operate more broadly than that. It's a background in which the death of paper has been valorized and proclaimed. It's a context in which digital dissemination and social networks have become the prevalent mode of dissemination. But at the same time, it's a history in which, despite the domination of certain digital behemoths like Google and Amazon, the reality is that in our particular sector and in many other sectors, the digital form has not taken precedence despite the proclamations that were handed down. I think that the misplaced notion of the death of paper is a pretty good place to start. It's long been prevalent. It's been proclaimed at the invention of any new particular technology, whether it was the telegraph or the telephone. Numerous opportunities have been utilized by mass media. It's quite simplistically a construct of mass media that one medium will be replaced by another. I think that it also is suggestive of the way in which media work, or mass media works to suggest an ineluctable progress or tide of change, to proclaim the new as a replacement. And again, we all know that in reality this is not necessarily how these things work in the real world. I think a perfect twist on this particular context is this quote that I love from the Irish playwright Bernard Shaw, which is clearly not so much a paean to paper as a kind of sliced barb at humanity's failings, but I think it kind of proclaims a particular position in relation to paper. In the mid-1990s, I was working as a curator, and I wrote a couple of books about photography, one of which was a survey of contemporary practice in 1994-95. It included the work of 72 photographers from people just emerging then, people like Andreas Gursky, to fashion photographers like Nick Knight, and I wrote a text which attempted to consider the current usages and applications of photography from in different media. And I then received a grant to travel around Germany, which was perhaps the most formative project I did, and it was a book called Reconstructing Space, a book and show called Reconstructing Space. It was about the relationship between photography and built environment within the fabric and the history of German culture. It was a small exhibition at the Architecture Association in London, and it determined for me very, very clearly what I was interested in. It became clear to me that most photography, despite its malleability, is not automatically suited to the gallery wall, to oak frames and glass. The propensity that photographers have for demanding that their work is in every medium is not sustained in the gallery. And it made me realize as well through the process of making those couple of books that it was the book and the relationship between the photograph and the book page and the structure of a book and that process that most engaged me, and I felt that that was the space that I wanted to work in. Fortuitously, as these things happen in life, it was at that moment that I met the greatest kind of printer of our era, the German printer Gerhard Steidl. We started working together in 1996. A bit further. Okay, sorry. And over the course of nearly 2 decades, sitting alongside him, I learned everything I know, and we tried just about every single form of using paper to make books. We used up a lot of paper. We made nearly 1,000 books in the course of that period that I worked with him. And during that time, I was not only editorial director of the broad list, I was also given the opportunity to develop my own list, which was the beginning of me realizing there were specific things that I wanted to publish and felt were the most interesting things to use in the book form. I also, in that context, developed numerous artistic relationships with authors and artists that continue today, as you'll see through my history. I'm just going to lightly touch on some of those books now, show you a few of them, some of which you will know, and quite a few of which I hope you won't know. But in each case, they illustrate something about me and about my history and about my interests. This was the very first book we published under Steidl Mack, and the reason I want to show it to you is quite straightforward. It's about the design. It's about the way in which the content, the simplicity of the content, a sequence of, it's a very large format book. I still have a negative response to landscape photo books, even though these are landscape images. It was designed across the gutter, which is a rule made to be broken, but it's a difficult one to break when you're printing offset. And the book literally does have the sequence of the tops of treetops. The restraint of design, specifically the typography, is very specific, and it's something that when I look back at this book, I still look at it and I think, yes, that's a book I made, and it works. Continues to work after all this time. To something very, very different. Anders Edström is a Swedish filmmaker and photographer. At the time, he was working a lot in the fashion realm, working for a French magazine called Purple. He was one of the initiators of that magazine. I have no interest at all in the fashion photography world and have never worked with people with their work in that context. And Anders is a good example of somebody who worked in the fashion context, but my interest in him was something else. It was about the fact that he would photograph for the fashion realm, but his interest would not either be in the physical form or in the clothes that people were working with or advertising, but it would be in the milieu, it would be the context, it would be the street scenes. And he came to me with this idea to make a couple of books around his in a very unusual way. So the titles of each of the series relates to a small sequence of photographs. And in each case, there's a series of images related to spider nets, a series of images related to places, etc. And the design of it was something that I felt was quite extraordinary. It was engineered by him. There was absolutely no grid applied to it. It appeared to be haphazard and roughly hewn, and the images were placed instinctively on the page. More significantly than that even, the photographs were almost non-photographs. He's anti the notion of the photographic achievement in an image. It's almost about this passage of time through the images. And these little sags of images, which are filmic in a way, are the basis of his work. One of the reasons that I mention this project is that what you discover, I think, as you have made a lot of work, made a lot of books, is that you have certain habits, and it's true that you want to avoid tautologies and repeating yourself, but your taste, my taste is for a very particular thing, and it does inflect and infect everything that I do. And when I do these lectures and look back at a series of pictures, I start realizing how I've followed through those ideas on more than one occasion, but with different artists. And I'll come to an example of that in a moment. Collier Shaw is a New York-based photographer who I've worked with for many years, done a lot of books with. And this is my favorite of those projects. She is somebody who's very interested in the representation of the female form. And she discovered a book published by the American publisher Abrams in the 1990s, which was a series of drawings by Andrew Wyeth, a very famous macho male American painter who had fallen in love with one of his studies, one of his models, a woman called Helga. And the Helga drawings became this endless series of repetitions of these modes of representation of the female form, which was then published by Abrams. Collier and I bought up many, many copies of this book, and she then worked through this process of representing her own models, who were regularly these androgynous figures, male and female, in the poses, in the scenarios that Wyeth had used in relation to Helga, that he'd drawn her. But the process was to actually remake those pages with photographs over the tops of the drawings. And we used various kind of production devices to distinguish the images through a varnish, a gloss varnish on the photographs over the top, for example, to create these layers. It was a very complex and difficult book to make. One of the other reasons I like to show this book is that it's one of those projects which dropped like a stone into the marketplace and was never seen or heard from for years and years and years, until suddenly, recently, everybody's latched onto it and goes, oh God, that's an amazing book, and it's really important, but of course it's sold out and everybody gets very upset and spends too much money on trying to find a copy of it. I guess that's what happens in the marketplace, but and with collectors in particular. And those are the 5 different models she refers to. Collier, unusually, is also an artist who can write extraordinarily well, which is something that I'm attracted to. I have a series of books which are about, which are artists' writings, visual artists who also write well. The book was in a limited edition. To one of the best-known projects that I made. Paul Graham is a British artist who lives in New York, and he has made a trilogy of projects, which I will return to again in this talk, the second of which was about America, the second of which we published in 2007 as 12 volumes. In the case of one of the volumes, the green volume, there is one single image across the 4 pages of the book. The longest is 64 pages, sorry. And regularly there would be 2 or 3 series of images. And as I suppose will become very obvious, the inspiration for this book, for Paul, was the Anders Edström book, the completely unknown Anders Edström book from 2004. Paul approached it in a much more precise way. He would create these sequences, but again, the photography was about these. In this case, it was a sequence of images of shelves in a very poor supermarket in rural America, combined with a sequence of images of a man mowing the lawn in a municipal gardens. It really is as simple and straightforwardly as that. The sun is setting, and the rain begins to fall. And the camera at one moment beautifully captures that particular reflection of sun in rain. And really nothing actually happens other than this passage of time. And the beauty of the project is it really is that it says something about photography, its relationship to us and our own existence, but in the purest of ways, in many ways. So as I've already mentioned, in 2000 and well, actually in 2010, I started thinking about Mack. Obviously, I started thinking about it much earlier than that, but in 2010, I started making plans to begin my own publishing. It emerged from a desire to curate a very, very clear and distinctive series of books, but not with any particular limitations in relation to media, not any ideas that it had to be photography or sculpture or writing, with the idea actually that the book form was the driving force. The idea that in making the book, whether it was with a sculptor or a writer or a photographer, that the physical object would be a piece of the work in itself. So as with Shimmer of Possibility, one version of that body of work is the 12 volumes, arguably the purest version of that. There is about to be a show of every single one of the framed works in a massive space in San Francisco, but that's never been seen before. Prior to this particular show, of course, the only full version was the book. So I'm attracted to that idea that the book is the platform, if you like, for the idea. And as a consequence, I'm attracted to, and artists have been attracted to me to work with me in that way. I'm going to show you a few books very quickly. This is a book that was published in 2010 prior to me leaving Style, prior to the actual legal existence of the publishing house. And it was a project with another of my long-term collaborators, Thomas Desmond. He was curating an exhibition in Monaco, and he'd become fascinated by a series of postcards produced by Magritte called La Carte Nature. And at the same time, the relationship between this work and the work of other contemporary artists as well as historical artists making photographs, sculpture, etc. in relation to the built environment was what he wanted to do this show about. And we managed to make a book which is absolutely a catalogue, but it's a catalogue which I think in itself is a long-standing view of these ideas. We're able to tease out through the design and the bringing together of the works many more ideas than he was able to show in the wonderful gallery spaces, no doubt, but the book took it to a new level. One of the great successes we've had, Christian Patterson, Red-Headed Peckerwood. I guess that I mention this book nowadays, partly because of the fact that I think it started something that has become a little bit overplayed nowadays, which is the use of additional add-ins, tricky design, if you like. In many ways, this is the most simple of books. It's predicated on the story about a young Starkweather couple who went on a killing spree through Nevada. And Christian went on the road and followed them, but he also then started fabricating elements of the story himself. In his studio, he recreated certain things, but he also found amazing documentation, which we then reproduced. This is literally as a brown envelope with an insert in it inside the book. The point I'm trying to make about the design, because I think it was extraordinarily successful in its moment, but there has been a kind of a huge amount of repetition of these tropes. Not that they didn't exist prior to this, but repetition of this idea of additional elements and layers through design which don't necessarily carry the content, and that would be my criticism of those, that design gets ahead of the work and takes away from the concept. And I'll put my hand up and acknowledge that we've played this game excessively. We have 3 editions. Every single one of the editions is different. The add-ons, there's a postcard in addition. This is the unbound version form of version 3. There's a booklet. There are all these various editions, and it's become more and more complex. He changed the pictures, certain of the pictures, added pictures, etc. So, you know, we've certainly played that game, and I'm guilty of that. And the third project with Paul Graham was in the trilogy of books about America, was called The Present. The reason I mention this one is because to come back to this idea of collaboration and how the process of collaboration, it's very rare that we take a book which is complete and accept that the form that it's been presented to us is the form that it should be in. Not that we feel that we have better ideas. It does happen, but not that we feel we have better ideas than the authors. It's just that we do bring something to the process, and it's that collaboration that we invest in. So Paul had this idea where he'd taken the idea of making street photographs in America one stage further. He was only shooting in New York, on the streets of New York, but there was a momentary distinction between the 2 or 3 frames. They're either diptychs or triptychs. And his original idea was that there would be 2 books side by side. It was an idea that I hated. I hated the idea. I don't like coffee table books, and I hated the idea you literally would have to have a table where you'd have the 2 books side by side. You would open them and then you'd be turning the pages. So his alternative to that was to use gatefolds. And it was so much smarter because, as a consequence, he was able to play even more with the idea of the transition of time through these very short sequences. In this case, on the half title page, you see the first image. Opposite the full title page, you see the second image in the sequence. In this case, both images are on a single page. This is a triptych. It's one of my favorites. Through these 3 images, the time taken is literally for that man on the left in the center of the frame to take a breath of his cigarette and exhale, and then step forward behind the cab. So the book form is fundamental to the way in which the work is experienced in this case. To a little book by a Swedish photographer, Morten Lange. I mention this because one of the things I feel really, really strongly about is that it would be very easy for me to publish well-known, established name photographers. I resist it really as much as I possibly can because I'm attracted first and foremost to ideas and to content. A lot of my publishing is of people who are completely unknown. And we are able to provide a platform for people. We're able to publish somebody who's unknown and get their work into the world. And in many cases, the publication of a book with us is greater benefit to them, actually, than an exhibition in a small gallery in London. And we use that as an opportunity to find really exciting and interesting work. And this is a very enjoyable project that I made with this young Swedish guy who then came to live in London briefly. And it's a book that's done him very, very well. He's ended up with some fantastic galleries across the world and has gone from strength to strength. An example of another pair of long-term collaborators, Brumberg and Schanaren, when they came to me actually it was when I was planning Mack and said, okay, we have this great idea, we want to make the Bible, we want to remake the Bible, an illustrated version of the Bible. I thought it was a fantastic idea conceptually. I just wasn't confident that we could do it in terms of production, to find a paper which would mimic Bible paper and facilitate double-sided 4-color printing. So that was the challenge to us, and the rest of the work really was theirs. They wanted to work with an archive. We found a couple of archives, both of whom said, no, you must be kidding me, we're not willing to allow our pictures to be applied to a version of the Bible. Interestingly enough, the process of getting the rights to the Holy Bible was much more straightforward. The rights to the King James Version of the Bible are owned by the University of Cambridge because of the translation, or the original translation of the King James, and they very willingly provided me with an unlimited license in relation to this project. So Adam and Oliver went to the Archive of Modern Conflict, a well-known publishing house as well as archive in London. It's a bit of a misnomer. Their collection is not only based around conflict, but a lot of the work is, and they wanted to use this as a touchstone to a certain element of what the Bible is about, which is divine providence, the way in which the Bible has a lot to do with God's retribution in relation to humanity. And they took images specifically related to certain pages, and as you can see, I hope they highlighted what they see as the caption related to each of the images. And it's a tough book, but interestingly, despite concerns, I would not have made a book of this nature out of the Quran, because the Quran is not a book that I grew up with. I have been asked that question before. This is a book that I grew up with. It's a book that defines the cultures that I have grown up in and lived in, and defines much of the kind of history of those cultures. And we've had absolutely no remonstration, maybe because it's an irrelevant little footnote in history, but we've had no negative reaction to it at all, actually. And there is an essay at the end by philosopher Adi Ophir about this notion of divine violence. I mentioned the support of young and emerging photographers. I established 4 years ago an award called the First Book Award. It's gone from strength to strength. We now, as of this year, there is an exhibition of accompanying the award, which is the main element of the award is that their book is published in collaboration with us. But alongside that, they are now given an exhibition, a solo exhibition as well, in the media space, which is a new space in the Science Museum in London. So the great thing about it is I think it's the most extraordinary opportunity that we have to see a diverse array of new work. And it's the reason I continue to do it. Every single year I've published at least 2 of the books, not just the winner. I've published other books out of the list because the work is so strong. This is an interesting story because Paul's work was referred to me by a process of nomination, was referred to us by Stephen Shaw, because he studied with Stephen at Bard. And he sent along a very unassuming and quite terrible maquette in which each of these images were tiny in amongst a big amount of space. And I was desperate to publish it and desperate to make it into the book that I immediately thought it should be, which was a children's wipe clean sort of board book. The process of convincing him, it took some time, but he was convinced in the end. And I feel that the idea of the design fitting the content has worked pretty well in this case. These very strange home-built sculptures that his work is about. To something entirely different. I am working with a number of people who have large collections of work. The Italian photographer Guido Guidi, who's in his 70s, is one good example. And the book that I wanted to start with was having spent time with him and his archive in Italy, was this project, largely because it kind of marks his history very clearly. He studied architecture, and one of the very first projects he made was the study of a room. This drawing, which is on the front of the book, is of this room that he came across standing in a field, and it was the trajectory of the light across the walls that he wanted to map with his camera. And this drawing is also the basis of the captioning in the book, which, as you can see, so this is the image 1, or was that 7? I can't quite see it, of wall A, and it continues like that. It's the most simple and pure and straightforward little thing. So coming quickly up to date, 2015, we produce a couple of catalogues a year. This pink volume here, it's downloadable on our website, but you can also get it outside. And just to give you, we're publishing between 20 and 24 books a year. One of the hardest things I do is to ensure that we do no more books than 20, 24 books a year. I've suffered the consequences of saying yes too much. And then the challenge is to do a diverse array of different things that continue to excite us. So listed here, the first book is by a young French photographer, Carly Steinbrunn, which is a book that is being printed in 2 weeks' time. The next is a massive book from the collection of the Victoria and Albert Museum. related to Julia Margaret Cameron's work and her relationship to the South Kensington Museum as it was originally known. Archipelago, which I'll speak about a bit more in a moment, a young Brooklyn-based photographer, Matthew Porter. A very unusual book by Thomas Damon called Blossom, where a single sculpture has been photographed and rephotographed, and which is accompanied by an extraordinary concrete prose poem by Ben Lerner. A new book by Ron Jude, another book with him called Largo, another book with Geri Johansson, the Swedish photographer. I've done numerous of his city books. This is the one with about Tokyo, a book with Wendy Ewald about Israel, and then a catalogue with Paul Graham, which I'll come on to now. But at the beginning of this year, we published a book with Alex Soth. I'd worked with Alec with his project at Stidle, and we are republishing those books in due course. But to begin with, he wanted to publish his first major book in 5 years. And this comes out of the LBM Dispatches. He was publishing on his own for many years, and then came to me because he wanted to kind of do it in a quite different way and give up responsibility for certain of the elements of self-publishing, which he was finding rather onerous and which were effectively distracting him from doing what he wanted to do, which was to be a photographer. If any of you don't know about this, it's the LBM Dispatches were him working with a writer, traveling to various states around America, and photographing communities who were getting together in the digital age, effectively, and photographing these moments of engagement, physical engagement, and using this as a particular touchstone to talk about the nature of society in contemporary America. He wanted, instead of using Brad Zeller, his partner, his writing partner's text in the book, he wanted to use something else. So instead he used extracts of lyrics from the Great American Songbook. It's very humorous and has a wonderful light touch, as well as being kind of really far-seeing, I think, about contemporary American culture. Kawada-san is one of the kind of greats of Japanese photography. I've started traveling there quite a bit recently and have a number of projects lined up in the next few years with Japanese photographers. This was a project which he had published as a magazine in a small version in the 1990s, and he wanted to do a new version of it. It's a seminal body of work in Japanese photo history. And this was an opportunity for him to realize his ideal of making it into the full version, if you like. In this case, the binding was very important to allow it to lie very open, so there were lots of kind of strategies we needed to consider for that. And he wrote a text as well, which the book is reversible. It starts at the back in Japanese and at the front in English. And there's a gatefold which the text is in Japanese and English in each of the books. To something quite different and something I'm becoming more and more interested in. I touched on the idea of text. I'm interested in working with curators and people with ideas. I'm working with David Campanay, the English writer, about an extraordinary project of work, which is his great work. He's been working on it for over a decade, about the relationship of photography to dust, which is a show at Le Bal in Paris in November. And those sorts of projects are interesting me more and more, that the book can in some way encapsulate so much more than the exhibition and allow for various strategies and approaches and viewpoints into the ideas. This is a project that we published earlier this year, alongside an exhibition at the Science Museum in relation to their collection, the biggest collection in the world of photographs related to the development of photography around science. So the idea that there was the development of photography was often pushed forward through its scientific possibilities and how this then affected artistic practice. I mentioned Matthew Porter, Archipelago. My reason for touching on this one is that this process was quite interesting. Matthew was having a moment. He was having one of those moments that artists, authors often do have. He produced a series of pictures of flying cars through the streets of Los Angeles. He made a huge amount of money very quickly from his galleries, and he came to me with the photographs, and I said, well, they're very pretty, but it's not a book. You know, he was very disappointed, but I thought that his work was really interesting with the other work that he showed me. So he went away and came back with another idea. It took 3.5 years before we actually made this book, with us just constantly going back and pushing him and pushing him. And we can't take any credit other than the cover design. The structure of the rest of the book was entirely down to him. And this is the book I'm most excited about this year. It's not original, but his understanding of the medium of photography and his explorations of his relationship to photography through the design and form of this book is unusually far-seeing. And it came entirely through him. The design came entirely through him. A very important factor, I think, in all publishing is not to, obviously I run a business and I sell commodities, but I also attempt to not shy away from difficult subjects. I'm involved, with some regret, I'll admit, in a project related to Israel and Palestine where 12 photographers were commissioned to travel there and make work. I say regret because it's tough, because there's too many characters involved, because there are many challenges. This, I believe, is the most important of those projects. Wendy Ewald is an American educator and artist. Her process has always been to go into communities and provide them with cameras, teach them through workshops how to take photographs, how to represent their own communities, and then edit from their bodies of work to create exhibitions which she helps them to build. She did this in Israel and Palestine, but in the most extraordinary way. She worked in 14 different communities, some schools with children, but Druze, Arabs, a huge diverse array of different groups of different ages, and then came with an archive of 45,000 images, and we created this 400-page book. It's really hardcore. It has a lot of text in it. It's very tough. It won't sell very well, but it's a believe me, I believe it's the most important book I will do this year by a long way. And I just hope that kind of people take the time to read it, because I think it gives, having spent quite a lot of time there and working with artists who've been working there and with arts communities there, I think the problem of representing issues like this are obvious. And there's a limited amount of interest more and more these days in that sort of artistic representation. And I believe this is an important one. And finally, in relation to forthcoming books, this is a book that was printed a couple of weeks ago with Paul Graham, and this is kind of full circle in a way. This is a trilogy. This brings together the trilogy of the 3 American projects. It's called Whiteness of the Whale, taken from the Herman Melville Moby Dick book, and it's about America's relationship to itself. And it includes the majority of The Shimmer of Possibility, American Night, and The Present in a very different form, in a catalogue with a number of extensive, one extensive and 2 other shorter texts. I want to, if you don't mind, just jump back quickly. I think I'm taking up too much time, but I want to jump quickly back to April 2010 when I was in New York planning the first Mack publications. And it was just days after the iPad had been launched. And I realized, it wasn't exactly an original thought, but I realized that, as many people did, that perhaps this was a watershed, that this was a moment at which things would change quite fundamentally. Potentially, this marked the moment in which it was clear that the majority of content was perhaps going to be read through screens, if it was not being done already, but that perhaps, therefore, the future of my type of publishing as well would be on screens, would be through the likes of the iPad and other screens. My role as a publisher is, after all, to find audiences for the authors and their ideas, to work as a translator alongside them, and to work in spaces. And if those audiences are interested in reading through screens, then I felt it was my responsibility to explore those digital possibilities. And many of those anyway, so this you know, the furore around the launch of the iPad, I thought was perfectly summed up by this rather tongue-in-cheek Wall Street Journal quote. I'm going to show you a few of these, for each of them for different reasons. So this is a project. The Holy Bible that I did with Brimberg and Schoenaren was based on their experience in the Brecht archive. They discovered Brecht's Bible, which he had heavily illustrated with images that he'd cut out and stuck into his Bible. And the project that we started out on was making this a new version of his War Primer, which was a book that he published in 1955. He was cutting images out of newspapers and journals between the First and Second World War and sticking them into making collages and writing these photo epigrams to kind of comment on the usage of photography as propaganda, the misuse of photography in relation to the representation of war. And they were very interested to update this War Primer, as it was referred to, by using images from the internet and related to the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. We immediately came across problems. For example, who knew that the Abu Ghraib images have all been licensed by the American soldiers through Associated Press? So when I went to Associated Press and said, look, these images are widely available on the internet, but we want to use 5 of them in an art book, small edition, 3,000 copies. And they said, that's fine, $10,000 per image. And of course, there was no way in the world we were going to, well, either could afford or were willing to pay Associated Press and the American soldiers for that usage. So I bought 110 copies of a 1990s English version of Brecht's book, and we, with some difficulty, printed stickers of the images that they downloaded from the internet. They silk screened the text onto these individual books and placed by hand the new images into the original book. So as with the Collier Shaw book, it's a book of a book within a book. This is a situation, ironically again, in which my usual printer refused to print the images because they were so objectionable, was the word that was passed back to me. Despite the fact that the images are widely available on the internet, they weren't willing to print them. We got around that in the end. But so their book inhabits the pages of Brecht's original and plays off his epigrams and plays off the cross over time. Sorry, just to make clear, so I decided that I was happy to take a chance with making 100 copies of a book and letting AP sue me if they felt that there was any value in doing that, which of course they never did, largely because there's not much to attach to in relation to the value of the income out of that 100 books at £100. I think they were £100. They sold out immediately. And in many ways, that is the problem with, in many cases, I feel, for a lot of this type of publishing. They disappeared immediately into collections, etc. We had to work quite hard to buy a few back to make sure that one ended up at MoMA, and when we realized that, you know, it was acknowledged as being as important as we thought it was going to be. And we managed to do that. But the point is that the work was not available. The idea and the story and the narrative and the work was inaccessible. The obvious answer was to make a digital version of it. And to make a digital version of it, let's be clear, that is free to download. We have about 5,500 downloads of this so far, largely, of course, because it's free. But the important factor here is that we're able to use the digital as a means of dissemination to allow for access. And also, we were able to build around the edges of the actual book form additional intellectual content, essays by Brecht and other people who were interested in this body of work to provide other perspectives on the piece as a whole. And then you have a very straightforward, simplistic HTML5 based point of access to the images, which, of course, using all the devices, you can go in on the details, you can also search in the texts and bring up footnotes, etc., all the stuff you would expect. So I believe that's a life beyond the original physical form of the book. Another example, Kodachrome Luigi Giri, a lost manifesto for photography that I believe in very strongly. I believe in trying to make available, again, books that have passed into collectordom, passed into these ridiculous prices. This is a book that he published in 1973, and there's one upstairs for 1,500 euros. It's a simple, badly printed paperback book. You can buy our version of it for 20 euros, I think. And the important thing is about access. It's about dissemination, because this is one of the most important books in photography, and anybody who's interested in photography should not only see it, but read it. It's so early, and his work is widely known now, but this is his manifesto. This is what he laid down. He published it himself. And importantly, what we did is his original text was in English and in Italian, of course. We translated that text as well into French and German to create this booklet that was inserted, again, to be able to allow people access to his ideas, which I think is the most important process. And this is a book that's done well digitally, partly because of that issue of people not being able to access the physical version necessarily, or certainly not the original, and also the fact that it's text heavy, the texts are searchable, etc., and they become a point of reference. This is the first winner of the first book award that I mentioned. And the digital offered it's an unusual book. It tells the story in the text at the beginning about the author, Anne-Sophie Merriman, and her relationship to her grandmother's collection of postcards. And the book is a very simple one in which you have the front of the postcard on one side of the page, you turn it over, and on the other side is the back of the postcard. Except for the fact that they're very, very strange images to be postcards. And you start wondering precisely what it is that this history is and trying to understand, as Anne-Sophie writes in the introduction, what was this woman's life about? Who were these people who were writing to her? At the back of the book, there are 2 pages which are stitched together, in the center of which it says, "For my grandmother." You have to destroy the book, open up those pages to discover that actually the whole of the project is a fiction by a young Japanese artist called Miki Sojima. The digital version allowed us a completely different presentation. It allowed us to have all of the images available on the screen, so you could touch a single image. The image would then flip, and you would see the back of it. Very simple little device. And there was also a device at the end where the final version of the solution trickled down through a piling up of letters. But I think that somebody mentioned this earlier. I don't believe that these digital objects, calling them books, I think it's a misnomer. They're not books. They're something entirely different. The linear experience of sitting with a paper book and reading is not actually that distinct haptically in terms of a haptic experience as it is sitting with an iPad. One of the fundamental differences, though, is understanding what you can do with the digital. What you can do with the digital is allow points of access to the content beyond the linear. And it's those new systems of navigation, which we're all very used to now through our kind of use of the internet, which are the ideas that need to be explored. But I really don't think that they are books. And I don't feel that most of the time that they should comply to the form of the physical book. But we should be adapting the medium, whether it's paper or bytes, to the particular content. It's always, always about content. I think that the most successful digital object that we made is this one. Jason Evans is an English photographer, and he spent a lot of time on the streets of New York, Los Angeles, Paris, and Tokyo, photographing, making street scenes on a 35mm camera, on film, exposing, taking the film out, reloading the film, and re-exposing. So analog double exposures. 700 of them he ended up with in the archive, 700 usable versions. Now, he wanted to make a book in which there was a single image on one side, so we designed a book which had 80 of these images. Opposite each of these images was a gradation from white to solid black, just a percentage building up. Very, very simple, straightforward book, but it only has 80 images. That's the colophon page of the whole book, is on the inside of the back cover. Really straightforward in theory, except that it carried with it enormous frustrations for him because of the fact that it failed to encompass the majority of the work. So instead we made an app, iPad-only app, I'll admit, in which we wrote an algorithm for the 600 images, none of which were in the original book, which are combined randomly in a random sequence every time you review it. And there are also 17 synthesizers which randomly combine. When he was shooting all this work, he was listening to drone music. And the 17 synthesizers combine to make an original piece of, well, not original, but there is a variation on these 17 synthesizers recombining. In a very nerdy way, the only person who could work this out in our studio was the software guy we commissioned to write the algorithms, and he said you'd have to watch this for 2 lives of our son to see that same combination of image sequence with musical score. So the idea is that it is an original digital work at every single viewing. Simple, yes, controlled, not allowing the points of navigation that I talked about, quite the opposite of that, so breaking that rule, but something that I feel was successful in exploring the digital possibilities. I just want to now, if you don't mind, just talk about digital media in general, because the explosion of digital media has been the backdrop to my life in books. And it's fundamentally altered the world of publishing, that's clear. Digital alternatives will ultimately dominate certain sectors of previously paper-based publishing. Science, medicine, technology have largely been digital for a dozen years already. Educational books, similarly. Interestingly, in relation to magazines, there was an initial shift towards the digital, but in the mainstream, those magazines are failing. Condé Nast Traveler might be failing, but there's a huge number of small, independent travel magazines, expensive travel magazines that are published biannually, which are doing very well, selling 45,000 copies. So there's a shift away from much of the notion that paper is dead and paper is dying. Paper and ink have proven remarkably resilient, as is proven by all of you being here. Also, let's not forget the archival uncertainties of hypertext really are throwing up serious issues for everybody who's considering how it is they retain the memory of all that information. So the permanence of ink is something that sustains the environment in which I work. And certainly certain types of paper publishing are now given the opportunity of a future that was apparently going to disappear some time ago. The second major issue I'd like to mention is that the way people buy books and hence the way in which they're distributed has fundamentally changed. I've said this many times before, sorry if you've heard it before, I know you have, Nicolo, but Amazon are not interested in books, that's pretty obvious. They provide a fantastic service, but their interest is actually in that algorithm no, it's a combination of their fulfillment capacities, which are second to none, there's no question of that, and that algorithm through which they garner your personal details, through which they garner your contact details, your credit card details, and your buying preferences. That's the gold in their project. It's also the basis upon which they are the Walmart of today. It's easier to, in most places in the world, even where I live in London, to shop through Amazon than it is to shop through in local shops. The impact for small publishers like myself, especially in the illustrated and art sectors, has been double-edged though. It's increased the geographical reach that we have through the internet, through our websites, but with a ridiculously reduced return on those sales owing to the discount structure that Amazon operates. So if you operate through Amazon and you're not operating direct, you're losing more than you can bear to lose based on the production the basis of most books. So if somebody's distributing through the mainstream illustrated art book channels in America, there's no way, if you're European-based, you will be making more than a few percent on the retail price. Amazon discount all new books at 37% on Amazon.com, and the publisher has to give up to their distributor 30% of net, etc., etc. It all breaks down, and the publisher ends up with about 19%, which is not sustainable on the production cost of most of these books. I just want to finish, actually, by saying it's quite ironic that the burgeoning interest in the photo book can largely be ascribed to this digital revolution. Photographs are so easily applied to a multitude of different media, such that photography is in effect blamed for the overload of images that we apparently suffer from. The rise of screen-based reading and virtual experience have rendered the difference between photographs spread far and wide on the internet and their physical reproduction in the controlled and primarily linear form of the paper book. And this new interest in the photo book has allowed for a multitude of author-led initiatives in self-publishing and an explosion of small publishers like myself. It's an exciting time and phase in the history of the photo book, but the digital and the physical forms are inextricably intertwined, and the possibilities of the digital in relation to sales and marketing, but also in other areas as I've tried to touch on this afternoon, these new spaces of engagement are, I believe, one of the most interesting and exciting elements of the future. But I'd also like to issue a note of caution, because to suggest that now in this place, here, in this moment, we're in something of a bubble that is very, very likely to burst. I'll illustrate that partly by reference to my present here. I showed my wife on the website the very kind reference that was made to me on the website for the Vienna PhotoBookFestival as a star publisher, and the guffaw that resulted from her certainly burst my bubble at that particular moment. But at the same time, on that very same page, Nicola, your photo book is referred to as the most successful photo book of 2014 and then 2015 in a separate reference. And I think there's danger in this hubris. I'm sure that Benedict Taschen and Sebastião Salgado would have quite a lot to say about that, given the fact they've sold 115,000 copies. So, we are in a good place, and it's a great, great moment for experimentation. But I think that my belief is that we need to be looking outward even more about the possibilities of taking this important content that we all believe in and finding new audiences for it, because we are in a very small place here with a knowing audience, and that there's much, much more interesting people out there, interested parties out there to whom we should be reaching. Thank you very much.